Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to this second live talk. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are from. And thank you so much for being here today. I will start this live talk. So welcome everyone. This is the second live talk of financing organic waste methane mitigation this live talk is to focus on small island and developing states, SIDS. My name is Daniel Ostale. I'm a researcher at the Center for Clean Air Policy. Here we call it CCAP, so we listen to that a lot. And today I have the pleasure to be your moderator. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before beginning. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be shared with the participant afterwards. The session will be in English. And why we appreciate a lot to see your faces. So please, if you can turn on the camera, it will be great. Emma, I see you, so thank you for that. But however, let's try to keep the microphone muted during the session to not hear background noises. Yes, the idea today is to be connected, the team, but also with the participant, because we really need your participation here. Feel free to use the chat, introduce yourself, tell us please where are you coming from, the organization that you work for, and we will have questions throughout the discussion that we would like you to answer, and we will try as well to address as many questions as you have for our panelists, our amazing expert panelists, with the live Q&A at the last part of the live talk. So that's it. Let me briefly introduce you the agenda. We will start with the keynote from Alison Bender, the Executive Director of CCAP, who will frame the policy brief initiative that we are doing and revisit the core financing challenges that we identify already in our first live talk, with a specific focus on the scales and risk that happens in SIDS. Okay. Then we will this part will follow by an expert roundtable moderated by Diana Rodriguez, which bring together huge expertise from practitioners, financiers, policy actors that are working directly in SIDS context. And after the roundtable, is one of the most exciting part. We will facilitate a Q&A with the audience and close with next steps. So let me start with some questions for you. I'm sorry. So first, so you will see in your screen some questions. We want to see what is the pool of people that we have.
Are you able to put?
Are you able to see? Yes.
It's on the chat, by the way. It will, if you go to the chat feature, you will be able to see the poll.
The second question is about how familiar are you with organic waste composting? And finally, there is this open question. If you want to, if you came because maybe you know any of the expert and you want to answer one specific question that we want to do for the experts, please feel free to write them. Nice. I can see some of the answer here. Very even, by the way, 23%. Like very even between designers, learn to explore, policy regulation. Most of you are coming from the policy and planning side. Okay, projects, but I see projects very highly in the part of which type of things you would like to ask. So we will have to ask about what a specific project and how they were developed. Okay, so with this, I will present Alison, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Clean Air Policy, and she leads CCAP overall. and its intersection of climate and policy and finance. So Alison, what she will do is to frame this policy, frame this session and the policy brief initiative that we are doing. And this is very important, helping us to rethink how we conceptualize the scale and risk that is facing, in particular, SIDS. So, Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're here because methane mitigation has become one of the most urgent climate policies and priorities that we have. Unlike CO2, methane reductions can deliver rapid climate benefits within the next decades, making it a critical lever for near-term climate action. At the same time, one of the largest and most overlooked opportunities to reduce methane emissions lies in how we manage organic waste. Yet, despite this clear potential, financing for methane mitigation in organic waste systems remains extremely limited, particularly in SIDS. So today, I would like to briefly set the stage for this second live talk by explaining three things. First, why organic waste matters for methane mitigation. Second, why the challenge is particularly complex in the context of SIDS. And third, why we are organizing this series of live talks to better understand the financing barriers that face these projects. So let's begin with a couple of things, right? Let's get some facts out of the way. As many of you know, over 20-year time horizon, methane is a warming impact of around 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. This means that reducing methane emissions can have a significant impact on slowing global warming in the short term. And when we look at methane sources globally, the waste sector plays a major role, accounting for more than 20% of emissions. Keeping that in mind, when we look at SIDS, around half of municipal waste is organic. When this waste is disposed of in landfills or open dumps, it becomes a major source of methane. This means that how organic waste is managed plays a critical role in methane emissions. But it also reveals something important. Because such a large share of waste is organic, the potential for methane mitigation is also extremely high. So, in that case, solutions such as source separation, composting, and other forms of organic waste treatment can prevent most of these methane emissions from occurring in the first place. In addition, solutions often deliver multiple co-benefits. So this could be things like soil health, agricultural support, and of course, pressures on landfilling as less waste is going to the landfill. However, as we move from technical potential to real-world implementation, especially in the SIDS context, the picture becomes significantly more complex. Next slide. There are several structural challenges that shape waste management, particularly in SIDS. First, many countries rely heavily on landfills and open dumps for their waste disposal. So in this environment, organic waste decomposes and it releases methane emissions. Secondly, waste management projects in SIDS face significant scale and cost constraints. We have small populations, dispersed geographies, and this means that waste volumes are often relatively small, while transportation and infrastructure costs are very high. As a result, many waste treatment projects struggle to achieve the economies of scale typically required to make these investments financially viable. And third, there's the broader context of climate vulnerability. SIDS are among the regions most exposed to climate impacts, and despite contributing to only a small share of global emissions, so they have an outsized impact. This creates a clear paradox. On the one hand, there's a strong need to support mitigation and resilience efforts in these countries, And then on the other hand, many projects still struggle to attract financing required to move from concept to implementation. So while the technical solutions exist, the institutional, economic, and financial conditions necessary to scale them are often more difficult to establish. And so this all brings us back to a central question behind the work we're presenting today. Why, despite clear climate benefits and available technologies, is financing not reaching methane mitigation projects in organic waste systems? So better to understand this question, we have organized this series of 3 live talks, which together aim to inform a forthcoming policy brief. This has been supported by Environment and Clean Air, Environment and Clean Air from Canada, and their commitment to climate action and circular economy solutions has helped make this research and these webinars today possible. The objective of this policy brief is to understand why financing flows into the sector remain limited and why changes can help unlock investments. So we already had, this is the second talk, so we already had one discussion, right? In that first live talk, we focused on diagnosing the barriers. What we heard from our experts and participants working in municipal waste systems, composting initiatives, and climate finance was actually really revealing. In particular, the discussion highlighted that the main constraints are often not the availability of capital itself, but whether organic waste projects fit the financial logic and the risk expectations of traditional investment models. And the main issue, therefore, is not necessarily the absence of capital. Instead, it's the challenge often lies in the mismatch between how composting projects generate value and what traditional finance considers a bankable investment. Many projects struggle because pricing structures and policy incentives still favor landfilling, while uncertainties around operations and service delivery increase perceived financial risk. So together, these factors make it difficult for projects to move from technical design to actual financing and implementation. All of this helped frame today's discussion. In today's talk, which is the second live discussion, we want to explore what happens when stakeholders attempt to move from real-world implementation to financing. What are the specific constraints that appear at this stage? What role do financial institutions, development partners, and policy frameworks play? And probably most importantly, what changes could help unlock investments in this space? We want to accelerate methane mitigation and to do so, improve the financing landscape for organic waste solutions, and you are an essential part of that. Thank you, and I hand back the floor to Daniel.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you so much for this insightful framing and for the policy brief initiative and grounding. That's the idea, today's discussion that will start right now, because it is a great pleasure to introduce you our panel of experts. First, we have Soledad Villarroel from the Inter-American Development Bank based in Belize. She works on water and sanitation projects that intersect with the waste management and sustainable infrastructure. Second, we have Yudlin, co-founder and CEO of Granada Grows, who is leading community-driven organic waste diversion and composting effort in Grenada that link waste streams with generative agriculture. We have also with us today from Samoa, Amardeep, a waste management and marine litter specialist with a broad international experience supporting data-driven and practical waste solutions in island and developing countries context. And last but not least, we have Ronald Roach, Director of Climate Resilience, Environment, Water and Waste Unit and Waste at the Unite Caribbean Group. Sorry for that. Ronald brings more than 3 decades of experience in waste management and environmental operation across the Caribbean, including leadership roles in national solid waste system, and regional advisory work. But to moderate this roundtable, we have Diana Rodriguez, Senior Waste Policy Associate at CCAP. Diana works on waste in the waste sector policy, helping to bridge technical design, institutional framework, and practical implementation challenges, particularly in the context that we are discussing today. So, Diana, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And welcome to this expert roundtable that will focus on financing barriers in organic waste management, specifically for composting. And today we'll bring the spotlight for the SIDS context. So as Daniel mentioned, we are joined today by 4 of our experts that bring diverse perspectives from the SIDS in the Caribbean and the Pacific regions on these topics of implementation, but also private sector leadership, multilateral support, and finance. So thank you all, our panelists, for being here. And maybe to add onto the introduction that Alison framed at the beginning of this live talk, I just wanted to add that the reality of SIDS in waste management has several aspects to consider, and I'll mention just a few relevant that are very linked to composting. So first, in islands, available space for final disposal, as Alison mentioned, is limited. And in most cases, there's an urgency to find more sustainable solutions, which is a really pressing issue. Some SIDS, or several of them, still rely solely on dump site systems. And the ones that have been able to invest in sanitary landfills are currently in need to reduce the amount of the waste that's being taken to those sites to extend those lifespans as much as possible. And of course, we know that around 50% of the waste that is generated is organic, as Alison mentioned. So focusing on alternatives for this fraction specifically becomes crucial to extend that lifespan or to bring sustainable solid waste management options to SIDS. But the scale of alternative projects like these that would divert organic waste is much smaller than in other countries of the global south in SIDS. And decentralized systems are often what would make more sense to set up because connectivity to transport waste amongst different islands or even within islands is very challenging. So in terms of access to investment resources, which is the other side of the discussion, then climate finance structures often overlook these types of realities on SIDS, the importance of investing away from final disposal in facilities that are relatively small and that might be atomized because of the need of decentralization. But as we know, composting as a technology is a path that is technically viable, it's cost effective, it can bring additional co-benefits, and that's a little bit what we want to talk about right now. So the question that we want to explore today with all of our experts is, why do composting projects still struggle to access that finance? And what alternative financial instruments could support the implementation of those expansions? And how to frame that in this context of SIDS. So I would like to start a round of questions with Ronald Roach. Ronald, as I mentioned, from the broader perspective of the SIDS in the Caribbean region, composting projects may often appear to financiers, especially, to be of insufficient scale, operationally complex even, and to require like high capex and opex flows. And that battles with the reality of weak or even non-existent models of waste fees. In your experience negotiating or structuring composting projects in the Caribbean, what specific concerns do financiers consistently raise? And which ones of those do you think are legitimate versus maybe just misplaced?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. It's great to be here to have this important discussion. For me, I think it's a question of, first of all, competition. Waste management in the Caribbean is really still at a very embryonic level. And a number of years ago, there was a World Bank report talking about the challenges with plastic waste in particular, and that the Caribbean region was some of the highest per capita producers of plastic waste, and that put a lot of focus on plastic waste management. So that's certainly one of the reasons we have lost sight of the fact that organic waste still is the greatest fraction of our waste stream that represents low-hanging fruit. So there's been a lot of focus on that plastic waste issue within the Caribbean. And waste to energy as well has also been a major focus for Caribbean countries. So the promises of waste energy to solve our waste management problems, whether real or perceived, that's what a lot of Caribbean countries are exposed to and are bombarded with sometimes. So unfortunately, organic waste projects seem to take a backseat within that scenario. I think the other aspect of the challenge is that waste management authorities and the government bodies responsible for waste management throughout the Caribbean are not equipped to be able to have those discussions about financing for composting projects. And so we see waste management as a public good rather than as a business that we need to develop business transactions around and so forth. And because of that, of course, there's a lot of work that needs to be to be considered in developing these composting activities and yeah, sometimes the authorities are just not equipped for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ronald. Yeah, I think that part that you mentioned, especially about how it's not seen as a business and combined with that lack of capacity to develop those projects, is something that's adding to that risk perception from financiers potentially. Thank you, Ronald. Let's now look at a model that is currently being tested in Grenada, which builds a composting solution based with the direct involvement of the private sector. So for that, I'm going to turn to Judlin and ask, and maybe to frame for our participants and also to the people that are here today that might not know the current context in Grenada. The government started a pilot, a composting pilot site last year through a public-private partnership model under the Grenada Grows Initiative, it's called, which Judlin is here leading that Grenada Grows Initiative. Judlin, could you walk us through how that alliance came to reality and what challenges it had to overcome in the design process, both from the technical but also from the financial perspective?
Sure. Good day, everyone. So I'm Judlin, the CEO, co-founder of Grenada Grows. So to start there, I have to go back a bit just to add context. So Grenada Grows is a public-private partnership. Our aim is really to divert the organic waste from the landfill, but not only by making compost. So our full mission is to utilize fish waste. In fact, it started with fish waste through one of my consultancies. So my brief background, which would frame this, is that I've worked in waste management for several years, living in the US, moved back to Grenada, did several consultancies, and that directly really created the bonds with the Solid Waste Authority and other stakeholders. So the partnership started by looking at the needs. So there was a need for diverting fish waste, actually. And one of our partners, a co-founder of Grenada Grows, is Organolog. Organolog is a US company in Kentucky utilizing fish and chicken waste to make soil food, one of the products we intend to make. We then took that project. So once we decided we could have that partnership with the Organolog, because the soil food was one of the key products, we wanted to move away from imported fertilizers. We then went to the Solid Waste Authority, knowing the importance of this partnership. We went to them and almost immediately they agreed. And so that partnership in concept started in 2022. We went through, it had to go through cabinet. So that took two government cycles, administration, sorry. And in 2024, the cabinet approved the project. So Grenada Grows as a company to create soil food, plant food, compost, mulch, and other products for agriculture. As we explained, funding has been a really key issue. So our current ask is about close to $5 million US. Thankfully, through the Republic Bank Power to Make a Difference initiative, we received a grant for $50,000. So the key challenge we had to overcome, how do we start with 50,000 EC dollars? So it really required a scale down. So that we also had technical assistance from Recycle Organics. We've been in that relationship. They've been helping technically in terms of a pre-feasibility study for composting. And so through that relationship that started in 2023, I believe, they're able to help with the equipment and technical assistance side of it. And so in the end of November, we were able to start. The challenge was using our limited funds to develop the site. But again, the key relationship we had with the Grenada Solid Waste Authority, we were able to use their resources. And so that partnership has just been fundamental in getting us where we are today. And so we currently have compost piles on the ground. We started selling wood chips because we got that demand from farmers through diverting the waste from the landfill coming in. We had a lot of wood chips in excess of what we needed for the compost. So really the key challenges were financing, space, and getting cabinet approval. And that's really how the partnership came about. It was that organic merge of different groups. Hopefully I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. I think it links a little bit to what Ronald was mentioning earlier about having a business model at the beginning or from the start. So from what I heard from you, it came from an idea from a private company that has already like a business model of using fish and other types of waste to make a business out of it. And then bringing that idea to the government, and that's how it kind of built. Although you say, of course, financing was also, is still probably an issue to scale up, but that's very interesting because it kind of connects what you both have mentioned for both of those of your perspectives. Thank you, Jotlin. Now I want to move maybe to Belize, and I'll ask Sole this question, and maybe again to frame a little bit the context in Belize. The Belize government has an interest of diverting all organic waste from the central regional landfill that exists in Belize. They have also transfer stations that bring that waste to that centralized landfill. And the governments also want to promote investment in facilities such as composting sites. There's that interest, at least at the national government now. And as a first step, green waste from pruning is not allowed at the transfer stations. It's not received and not received at the landfill. But in practice, there are no alternatives to manage that waste in any other way. So there seems to be no incentive currently to invest in composting facilities, even as the waste stream is available. And on the other hand, the national government has been collaborating for several years, even decades probably, with the IDB, that does have previous experience in setting up mechanisms such as revolving funds, specifically for the sanitation sector, IDB. And this fund for the sanitation sector has successfully created an enabling environment for financial resources to flow for infrastructure investment in that specific sector. Maybe, Sole, if you could tell us more about the current challenges to invest in composting facilities in Belize and how setting up such a mechanism in Belize maybe could be applied for composting and could, if it could, in your view, help start that implementation, incentivize implementation for composting and the waste sector.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to the panel. I think it's very important to have these exchange of experiences in different countries because I think that Caribbean countries mostly face same challenges or similar challenges when it comes to solid waste management. My name is Sole. As they mentioned, I'm originally from Ecuador, but I've been working in Belize, based in Belize for the ITV the last years. So I think that, as you mentioned, even though that the government is willing or have the willingness to start implementing projects or have a more solid waste management, within the country, we have some challenges that are mainly related, one, with a limited regulatory framework. So Belize doesn't have a framework for composting, and especially for the end use of the composting. No? So we don't have any regulatory framework that can say what's the quality of the compost, or what is feasible to use, for example, for agriculture, or whatever, any other use that we want to give it to the compost. There is no framework that we can, support on. So there's no guidelines for the quality of the compost. So that's one of the things. If we can implement facilities and have the end result of the composting, but we don't have any regulatory framework that can allow us, for example, to have a market for the compost. No, so I think that's one of the things that I have seen in Belize, or we have been facing here in Belize. The other one is that there's a high volume of organic. Like as you mentioned, almost half of the waste in Belize, also the composition of the waste is organic stream, but at the same time, even though we have a high volume, there is not sufficient source separation. So that means that there is the source, but we are not separating. So Belize doesn't have any programs or big programs that comes from the government for source separation. So that's the other challenge that I see. So right now, everything goes or ends up in the regional landfill. And the challenge comes also to the islands, with the volumes of organic, because everything that is produced in the islands has to be transported to mainland. So that's the authority, the Solid Waste Management Authority, which is the ones that are in charge of the final disposal and transport. It's a very high cost for them mobilizing the organics. So there is the need to have to find solutions, but we need to start source separation programs in Belize, so we can have actually to start implementing these facilities. The other challenge that I find is also financing. You also talk about the financing gaps and access to climate funds, because we also know that there are climate funds available, but there are not, or Belize doesn't have very well prepared projects or proposals to access to this funding. So we know that there is several options to apply for these funds. But I think we need to support or strengthening project preparation also. So project preparation is an issue here in Belize, because they don't have projects that they can offer or they can propose for climate funding, and even for the multilaterals, as you mentioned, I work for the ITV. So we always require a certain level of quality of technical studies, so we can, finance those studies or start financing those projects, which here I think we have a small weakness on project preparation also. And the other one is infrastructure. I think that, as I mentioned, since Belize doesn't has a limited pre-investment studies, so also coming to infrastructure and financing infrastructure comes a challenge, because there's not enough project preparation. So I think those are like the main challenges that Belize is facing now, and I think that here comes, the multilaterals, and we as ITV, we have identified those challenges here in Belize. So our job is kind of try to find ways to support the government and to support the country so they can start implementing these projects. So how is the revolving fund that you mentioned? So we have in Belize several years ago, through an ITV collaboration, we implemented a revolving fund for wastewater especially. So, and the revolving fund was financed by climate funds. It came from the JEF fund. So what we did is we apply as a multilateral for JEF funding. We got the funding, and then with that funding, we converted in a revolving fund for the country. So what's the revolving fund? The revolving fund is a financing tool which has an initial capital, and this initial capital provides loans for project implementation. And then these loans has to be repaid, so they flow back into the fund. This is a very concessional fund, so that means that the interest rate is very low. Therefore, the fund is accessible to public and private institutions, which I think is very important, because sometimes if you have a private, a small company, or that is willing, it's willing, for example, to invest in composting or in composting facilities, they don't have access to multilateral funds, for example, no? If there are small, even municipalities, even village councils, they don't have access to multilateral funding because the conditions that multilaterals as IDB have for granting loans. So I think that this revolving fund is the way that they can access these fundings, because if you are a small company, if you are willing to implement, as I mentioned, a small composting facility or any other related with solid waste management, then you can access this funding. As I mentioned, you have they could finance, for example, they could finance collection upgrades, source separation programs, centralized composting facilities. Also, I think it's very important to mention that Belize, and as most of the Caribbean countries, they are very touristic countries, and they rely on tourism as a main income. So also this revolving fund is accessible to, for example, hotels or restaurants, etc., that wants to implement within their premises any projects. For now, the revolving fund, as I mentioned, is functioning for wastewater. So anyone that wants to implement a wastewater treatment project, they can access to the fund. But regarding solid waste management, right now we also, as ITV, apply for JEF funds again from the IGOS program, and we are gonna do with those fundings, with part of those fundings, we are gonna also create a revolving fund for solid waste management. So the IGOS program is going to, besides the revolving fund, is going to have other activities that are related to strengthening capacities in the country, also improving infrastructure, as you mentioned, transfer stations, improving, also we have in mind implementing a composting facility in one of the islands. But yeah, I think that, as I mentioned, part of the grant, it's going to go to a revolving fund for solid waste management. So it's gonna have the same kind of criteria. You have a project, then we have to establish our eligibility criteria for that project. And the important thing is that this revolving fund is managed by a board from the government. So the manager of the fund is the Ministry of Finance. And then we have a board that it's the Department of Environment is involved. Right now for the wastewater, the water utility is part of the board. So that's also, I think, the success of this revolving fund. It's because the government is managing, and they are the ones that have the board to approve the projects. So we are thinking on implementing in the coming years a revolving fund for solid waste, which will be available for the private and public sector. And as I mentioned, even for hotels or any tourism establishments that want to access that funding to improve their solid waste management within their premises also.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Sole. And you bring several things that maybe we haven't touched upon. First, in your first framing, like the regulatory framework that isn't there to support the markets, which is a little bit connected to what we have spoken before about that business model that doesn't close. Mm-hmm. Then the capacity to prepare projects that are financeable is a second challenge. And then the fund, I think, is the most interesting as well. And hopefully it looks very promising. And maybe we'll have to look in the next years how that works to implement that in the waste sector. That would be, because having that concessional funds accessible not only to, as you said, government or public enterprises, but also to the private sector, it would be like a big step probably to promote these activities. Thank you so much, Sole. Now, having this framing of the Caribbean, I wanted to go then to Amardeep, who has the view more on also the Caribbean, because she has a lot of experience working in the Caribbean, but also in SIDS in the Pacific. So you have worked in both regions, and I would like to know, when you compare Pacific and Caribbean seeds, what surprises you most? Where do they face the same challenges regardless of region, and where does the problem look fundamentally different to implement composting facilities or composting initiatives?
Hi, Diana and everyone. Thank you for having me today, and talofa from Samoa. So I just wanted to start by saying that unfortunately you got my title wrong. I haven't worked for APWC for 4 years. So I just wanted to start with that. But I wanted to talk a little bit from the perspective of a practitioner, as you said, who's actually currently got funding for a composting project in Samoa through Cycle Organic project. And we are actually the winners of a IDB Innovation Lab project to be implemented in Belize, hopefully very soon in 2026 as well, also implementing composting facilities. And I want to really focus my response on the challenges as implementers that we've experienced in receiving finance, I guess, for composting project across the board, both in the Pacific and the Caribbean. And I want to go back to what Ronel said in his introduction, as composting is still, or organic waste is still considered very much a waste management issue, a solid waste management issue. And we actually haven't successfully managed to connect it to being a climate issue as well. Like Sol said, there is a lot of climate finance available, but our project design often fails to connect this organic waste issue to the climate issue and be able to be a holistic way to communicate the challenge and the challenge that we are trying to solve through composting related projects. The second thing I wanted to mention, once again, going back to the fact that now that we've established that it's a waste management issue, I don't believe it is only a waste management issue, but that's how it's perceived. Most of the funding for waste management issues goes towards plastics because that's where the focus is. However, the solution to plastics within the SIDS context is not going to come from recycling, because recycling is very challenging at the scale that the SIDS produce plastics. So we want to focus on the top of the waste hierarchy. And at the top of the waste hierarchy, we need to reduce, reuse, recycle. But before going that, we need to rethink. We need to remove the current plastics that are coming into SIDS and replace them with alternatives. All those alternatives that are currently being looked at are organic in nature. So while solving the plastics issue, we are potentially going to replace certain plastic waste streams with organic alternatives. The answer to those organic alternatives is still composting. So what we've been trying to do while trying to access funding is to use existing funding streams, but trying to connect where the focus is and still bring it back to organics. The third thing I wanted to mention was the fact, the perceived risk. So while developing proposals, both for Recycle Organics as well as for IDB, one of the things we notice is that there is still, as Sol mentioned, a lack of information around the potential markets of compost. Although composting has been practiced for millennia, it is a centuries-old practice. We are trying to revive it in a modern context. However, there's still questions around, is there need for the composted product? How do we market the composted product? What quality of composted product as a minimum do we need to be able to market this in a consistent way? We know that farmers need compost, but what is a minimum quantity? We struggled in the Pacific region. I know that that's still the case in the Caribbean, is that we'd have no minimum standards for compost. The testing for final composted product is very limited and very expensive, even if we are making a consistent product. So all those challenges and barriers are consistently seen in both the regions that I've worked in. And finally, I wanted to mention, and I know I need to, I keep talking about this very often, is the fact that we are still trying to, while working with communities, I work a lot with communities, trying to implement composting processes using modern techniques, preconceived ways of how we want to go about doing this, while communities hold a lot of traditional knowledge on how to do it. In the Pacific, our outer islands and regional communities are still practicing traditional organic waste management techniques that we are not using or highlighting or supporting while trying to make compost in ways that are very Western or Eurocentric. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that we can actually support both of our communities and bring in modern technologies and have a more blended, balanced way of looking at it and proposing projects that brings our communities along on a journey which involves traditional knowledge as well. Those were my 4 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Amardeep. Super interesting as well, just to learn more about the Pacific. I myself have worked more in the Caribbean than in the Pacific, so it's very, very interesting to hear that. Yeah, again, the topic about plastics. No, I think Ronald mentioned that, and Jutlin, I saw Jutlin nodding that plastics has been the priority for so many years. But as you mentioned, there is a connection. If the plastics are well managed, organic, or the organics are well managed, the plastic will come much easier as well. And yeah, definitely the point you raised about that knowledge of the communities that have been doing this for so long is something that needs to be incorporated into the projects as well to make them more implementable in the realities of SIDS, definitely. This conversation has been super interesting, and I had another round of questions for each of you, but we're running out of time. So I wanted to ask you all just to all answer the same last question in 2 minutes each, so very, very shortly. And that would be, what's the one thing you wish more funders actually understood about what it takes to make these systems work long-term in SIDS? So what would be your recommendation to financiers? This is what you need to change in your perspective or in your mindset or in the access to finance, to provide that access to finance projects so that they become a reality in SIDS. Maybe we can start with Ronald.
So I think from the financier's point of view, it's recognizing that they need to provide assistance to some of these government agencies and the authorities, and so it's not just coming and agreeing on a project. It's helping get the baseline data. Sometimes the baseline data doesn't even exist. It involves understanding the legislative requirements, and so there is some amount of grant funding that is required in the first instance to be able to develop the financial proposals and the solid business plan that is required for composting, testing and all the activities that are required. There's need to understand and do a lot of groundwork, which there's an upfront cost. So I think financiers need to understand that and need to understand where that upfront cost can come from.
It's an interesting question, actually. While Ronald was speaking, I sort of opted to the opposite, in that what I've seen a lot of different international partners coming is really to pour in their support and finances to government institutions, and forgetting that very important link between private and public, and that the government can't do everything. And so a lot of the resources have gone into projects with the government. They've already been stretched with capacity, and a lot of these projects get nowhere, to be honest. So I think what they need to look at is to see the value in the private aspect of it, and that need to really help us to help the government. A lot of the times, because it's solid waste management, it's seen as a government problem, and so the resources are poured into the government. And no matter how much we've tried to show the importance of what we're doing and the connection, it's often laid off mainly to the public sector. And so I'd like them to see that important in these public-private partnerships, and that government institutions, although we need the policies and we need the enabling environment and we need all of these things, a lot of that has been done. I've seen it year after year happening. But if the dots are not connected, if the private sector is not enabled enough or involved, I think that's where the connection is lacking. So get us more involved and understand that the government cannot do everything, even if it's a public-private, even if it's a statutory body, soil as or solid waste is. The private sector, we are ready and willing to come in and help work with the government. This is our country, and we are here to do our part, but we need them to connect that dot.
Sure. Thank you, Jutlin. Sole, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question coming to an IDB. You know that it's a funding institution. But also, you know, even though we are a funding institution, I mentioned climate funds. You know, that are climate funds that are available. And what we have seen, because we also, as IDB, we can apply for climate funds, support the countries to apply for climate funds. What we have seen is that the climate funds requirements are sometimes very high requirements. You know, and we have to consider that maybe small countries are not yet there in the technical capacities, or might not have the technical capacities to have that level of projects or the quality of the projects that they require, or the indicators, the KPIs that they require. So I think that also for climate funding, it should be more depending on the country that applies, because it's not the same if Brazil applies for a 200 million project that Belize applying for a 2 million project that has the same impact maybe, but the difference is the size of the population, the size of the country, but the impact, the work and everything that is required to implement that project is exactly the same. So I think that also that if I could do something is like, you know, have these conversations with the climate funding agencies to be more flexible on the requirements that they have where a project proposal has to be submitted.
Super. Thank you so much, Sole. And go ahead, Amardeep. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. I think I just wanted to bring the conversation all together and basically say that often projects are geared towards either the government or the private sector, we find, but I feel like in order to have projects that are sustainable, both financially and on the ground, it would be really good to see funding for projects that support the private sector to develop and implement projects, at the same time support the government to reform. A bit of policy and levy reform is required, so that ongoing funding after the project finishes is available for the private sector through various through established policies to keep the projects going. And both those things need to happen at the same time. So projects looking at funding joint private-public partnerships perhaps would be really useful to see, or parallel funding for both implementation and policy reform at the same time, because one can't happen without the other.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Amardeep, and to all of you. This has been, I think this question closed good, and Amardeep was able also to close and bring together all the points that all of our panelists shared for this last question. And as you know, we're very tight on time, so I'll just give the floor now back to Danielle so we can finalize the session. I really appreciate all of your insights. This was very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you to all our experts. So now, for the sake of time, I will take just one of the questions that were here in the Q&A. And I will leave the floor to the experts to answer the question. So since we are very focused on financing and trying to see the gaps, there is this question that I found quite interesting, which is what type of institutions are typically authorized to create revolving funds, and do recognized guidelines exist to support a small-scale implementation by subnational government or private sector? So I think this question is more to Soledad, but I think it might be interesting for others to understand more about these revolving funds, how they works. So Soledad, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the question. Actually, the revolving fund was something that we as IDB invented, let's say, because no other countries had made it before. So what we thought at the moment that we have the funding, because remember that I mentioned that what we did is apply for JEF funds. No, JEF funds give you funds for the countries. So actually, when in this case, the revolving fund, we have JEF funds. So the JEF grants this funding to the countries. So at the end, the countries are the owners of the projects or the fundings that come from the GEF. So what we thought is, okay, if the funding is for the country, so that's why we gave it to the country as for them to manage the fund. So in Belize, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Finance is the one that manages the fund. So what we do, how we will support, what we do is we actually prepare the mechanism to use the fund. So with ITB collaboration, we prepare the mechanism to fund. So we establish the revolving fund managing board, what I mentioned, right? We support to have the guidelines and rules of how to have this managing board. We also prepare the eligibility criteria for the selection project. So we prepare a document for the government so they have how do the selection process, what's the minimum consideration that the project should have. We also have certain requirements if it is wastewater, for example, for the wastewater. So it has to be, it has to have a certain impact. So they have to have means of verification of the implementation of the project, etc. We also define, for example, the grace periods, the repayment period, the interest rate. So we give them the guidelines for the government to have those, to define those with the agreements that they are going to do with anyone. And as I mentioned, this funding can be accessed by private or public sector. So small small enterprises or small companies, as I mentioned, small hotels or any tourism establishment, they can access to the funding with these conditions that I mentioned. So the government has the guidelines, the conditions. Any public or private can apply for the funding. Then the board gets together, review the project, applies the guidelines, for selection of the project, criteria, etc., and then they choose the project that they are going to finance. But it's managed by the government with grant funding, in this case, from the GEF, which the beneficiaries are public or private. It can be small or big and enterprises. In this case, for example, the wastewater revolving fund has 5 million. So those 5 million are available. Every time that they repay, or anyone that gets the funding repays, so the revolving fund gets replenished again. So they can keep on using it.
Wow, very interesting. And also, yeah, for me at least, it was very clear. Very interesting that even a small project can apply to this type of fund. Because we have seen also that sometimes scale is important for some certain other types of financing products. And now, before going to the remarks that Maria Jimena will do for us, I would like to thank everyone that have been participating, such as Alejandra Pedraza, asking about access to funding. Also, I have here Linda, who just shared a document that maybe you have time to see. But again, thank you so much for your participation. And with this, I leave the floor to Maria Jimena.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to basically come in, and Amardeep, you already did such a great job in putting together all the remarks from the discussion. But I just want to close by bringing in 3 of the themes that stood out to me as we think about what we came to this panel to do. We wanted to understand what does it actually take to develop and finance organic waste solutions in SIDS. And I think that I saw throughout our conversation 3 quick themes. First, the topic of public-private partnerships, which we see everywhere, but we saw here how they can really unlock organic waste solutions. However, it was also highlighted that they take time and persistence. Dr. Jutlin's experience with Granada Growth shows that building the right coalitions across government, private operators, technical partners is foundational. Starting small, using the shared resources and maintaining those relationships is what made implementation possible of these PPPs. Second, highlight that financing remains the critical bottleneck across the different contexts that we saw today. Even when we see that there's a viable model model and government, there's government buy-in, a gap of millions between what's needed and what's available forces projects to scale down and improvise. Conventional finance and grants, because of this, are not just helpful, but they're often what determines whether the project will start at all. And then third, and importantly, regulatory frameworks are a precondition, not an afterthought. As Soledad described, for Belize, the government, there was a government willingness to act, but it was not enough when the regulatory framework for composting didn't exist. Without that foundation, even available waste streams cannot generate investment. So I just want to leave everyone with those 3 food for thought. The common thread here is that the barriers to composting in SIDS are not theoretical, they're structural, and solving them requires aligning financing, policy, and partnership at the same time. We'll keep on building on these conversations throughout the rest of our work here at CCAP. We have our last live talk coming soon as well, so we invite you all to be alert in LinkedIn when we announce it. Thank you all, and we really hope to see you next session. Thanks especially to our panelists for your time and your valuable insights. We really walk away with here from with a lot of food for thought. And I will also like to add that we would love to have you all participate in our survey. CCAP is putting together a bunch of different methods for this interview, for this research. Some of them are interviews, some of them are these live talks. And lastly, we have a survey that right now we just put in the chat. And we would appreciate if anyone that has expertise in waste, in the waste sector, can take a look at it and fill out the survey. We would really appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much.